Okay, hello and welcome again, everybody. My name is Ann Bennett. I'm the Executive Director of the Laurel Historical Society here in Maryland. I am joined tonight with our Education and Outreach Coordinator, Abby Carver. And we will be monitoring your questions and comments in the chat, as well as the Q&A. So we do encourage you to keep in touch with us through that way. If you are watching this recording at a later date, thank you so much for choosing to re-watch our recording, and you can get in touch with the Laurel Historical Society and our panelists by going to our website or following up in our email afterward. So I wanted to just welcome everyone to our third and final version of our spring speaker series here for the Laurel Historical Society. And as the trees are blooming, as the plants are blooming and blossoming, and coating all of our cars with that wonderful yellow-green pollen, it is very appropriate that we welcome Jimmy Rogers to our speaker series presentation tonight. Jimmy Rogers is a Laurel resident. He's a member of the Laurel Historical Society. And he's a very passionate advocate for native plants and native gardens. And as you can see in the preview slide behind us, that is the museum garden, and it looks a lot different than it did even just 1 or 2 years ago. And that is all thanks to Jimmy's advocacy and interest in the natural environment. So often at any museum, and in particular ours, we're very focused on the built environment and the people and the culture. But this is a way to expand our focus and our mission to talk about also the natural environment and where it intersects the people and residents today, as well as looking for the future generations and what we can do to preserve the culture, history, and natural environment. So I thank you for joining us tonight, and I thank Jimmy so much for presenting tonight, and we are very much looking forward to what you have to say. So Jimmy, take it away, please.
Thanks, Anne. Thanks, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm excited to talk a little bit about how museums can use native plants and then share the story of the Laurel Museum's new native garden. So I'm Jimmy Rogers, and I often identify myself first as a native gardener. Professionally, I have a background in both microbiology and project management, and I found both of those to be pretty useful, as it means I know how to read about science and I know how to organize projects. That said, there's nothing we're going to talk about tonight that you can't learn yourself or do at home. I'm the garden project manager with our local ecological group here, Laurel for the Patuxent. We're a nonprofit that works to conserve the Patuxent River as well as its watershed, which includes all of the homes and woods and animals and plants in and around the city of Laurel. Once a month, I write a native gardening column for our local print newspaper, the Laurel Independent. Actually, just had an article come out today, so check your mailbox for that. And lastly, it might surprise some of you to hear that I'm the president of my small HOA, Patuxent Triangle. Most folks see HOAs as against conservation-oriented landscaping. However, that's starting to change, both due to Maryland's state law allowing residents to garden for wildlife in HOAs, and because HOAs are themselves realizing that they benefit from better water and land management. Okay, that's enough about me. Tonight, we're going to talk about the goals and challenges for museum gardens, which Anne sort of alluded to, native plants and ecology. We'll look at some museums that are shifting to native plants, and then we'll talk about the Laurel Museum's native garden project and all of the steps that went into that. And hopefully we'll have time for lots of question and answer. All right, so when folks think about museums, most of the time, unless those are botanical gardens or some specific historical sites, the garden isn't what comes to mind first. You might be thinking of art exhibits or artifacts or the cultural stories being told in a museum. However, most museums do have some kind of garden, and I believe there are some unified goals. First, to make the space work for people, make the space look attractive, steward the land ethically, and make a garden that supports the museum's mission. I've put some examples in for each of these. The first three need to be met or the garden would detract from the museum. However, in the fourth goal, we have the opportunity for the garden to expand the footprint of how the museum engages the public and shares its mission. However, for many museums, there are challenges associated with creating a garden. Note that I'm using the term garden separately from a commercial landscape. So first off, gardens require a lot of time and care. Museum staff are usually completely busy running their museum, so gardening falls off of their task list pretty quickly compared to other mission-critical activities. As a result, the land around a museum building is often left entirely in the hands of landscapers who are not necessarily in sync with the museum's mission and designing something around that. Lastly, even if a garden gets designed and implemented, maintenance is often at best a contractual relationship with a landscaper who can sometimes make undesirable land stewardship choices. All of this can be further complicated by encroaching invasive species. Here you can see a carpet of lesser celandine that is creeping its way up toward the museum from the Patuxent River, where it has already completely taken over many areas. So imagine trying to create a vibrant garden that aligns with your museum's mission, while you also need to plan 3 museum events this month, and UPS just delivered those exciting new acquisitions, and you want to build your exhibit around it. So there's a lot of challenges. So where do native plants come into all of this? Well, first of all, native plants are well adapted to their environment, so they tend to grow robustly in the garden. Once established, they can crowd out weeds and grow through drought without watering. And in the case of lawn reduction, that's one less place you have to hire someone to mow. A very compelling argument for native plants at museums is that many museums, including the Laurel Museum, are about place. Native plants are generally from that place and can build a connection between the human element of the museum and the land. And I really appreciate that the Laurel Museum is interested in pursuing that. Lastly, museums are intrinsically stewards not only of their collections, but also the land they inhabit. Native plants contribute to good land stewardship practices, not the least of which is making habitat for creatures like this tiger swallowtail butterfly seen here on wild bergamot. To make sure that all of our terms are clear, native plants are plants that occur naturally in a place. That means we need to define where we are ecologically. Many folks are familiar with the USDA plant hardiness zones like 6B, 7A, etc. However, those zones stretch all the way across the country and don't say much about the unique ecological situation in our area. Native gardeners tend to focus on their watershed and their ecoregions. Maryland falls almost entirely within the Chesapeake Bay watershed, meaning almost every drop of water that lands in Maryland eventually flows into the bay. From there, Maryland is divided into 3 ecoregions: coastal plain, Piedmont, and mountain. If you look at the map, you can see a little red X that I made. That's where Laurel is, and you can see we are positioned right on the line between the coastal plain and the Piedmont. That means broadly, Laurel's native plants are the plants that scientists have observed as native to those 2 Maryland ecoregions. I'll put the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services guide on a resources slide at the end, which lists native plants by state and ecoregion. All right. Get my cursor going here. All right. So it's easiest to understand how native plants drive the rest of the ecosystem by looking at examples. Common violets are an excellent early season bloomer. It hosts the caterpillar of the fritillary butterfly. Here we see an adult fritillary on a butterfly milkweed, which is their favorite nectar source. They are important pollinators and humans love them. And this picture is from my front yard, and I can tell you when I first started seeing these come up, I was delighted. Winterberry, which you can see prominently at the Laurel Museum, hosts the caterpillar of the Harris's 3-spot moth. From this stage, it will either become a moth or it will become prey for a bluebird feeding its young. Caterpillars, particularly moth caterpillars, are the most important food source for baby birds, who can only eat live prey. Okay, so what if we try to use common non-native plants instead? If we replace the violets with liriope, which is from Asia and has no host relationships with our insects, it will produce no fritillaries or any other butterflies. If we replace the winterberry with a nandina, which is also from Asia, there will be no host in our garden for the moth caterpillar. So no adult moths or food for songbirds. In fact, the nandina has berries that are toxic to our songbirds, and cedar waxwings are known to gobble them up without knowing the danger, which can lead to their deaths. Most of our gardens are made up of non-native plants, and so this breakdown of the ecosystem has been happening more and more in our communities. In the last 50 years, we've lost about a third of our birds. This is an absolute tip of the iceberg, and if you're interested in learning more, I recommend reading one of Doug Tallamy's books or watching his recent talk at Google, which is linked here in the slides. It's also very easy to Google that talk on Google if you want to find it tonight. So that's the ecology. That's a little bit about, museums in general. I want to take a moment to look at some museums that are shifting either partially or completely to native plants. The first garden I want to highlight is might surprise you. Ladue Topiary Garden in Moncton, Maryland. In addition to a manor house museum, there are 22 acres of gardens with over 100 topiaries. And topiaries are shrubs sculpted into artistic shapes. This hunting scene references the history of the estate, which Harvey S. Ladue began to build in 1929. And he was an avid fox hunter. As you can see, the immense grounds have a focus on sculptural topiary with non-native species, open grass lawns, and other ornamental horticulture techniques. However, within their rows of Italian garden plantings, you'll often see native plants. Additionally, they have a very impressive native butterfly house with caterpillars gathered on the property. Most butterfly houses focus on exotic species of butterfly, but at Ladue, you can see the full life cycle of the insect, from caterpillar to chrysalis to adult butterfly, all on the native host plants growing inside the building. I said that they were gathered on the property, which might surprise some of you, looking at their formal gardens, which lack most of the host plants. This is because they have created an enormous managed meadow, which primarily contains native plants. In the high summer, it's an absolute spectacle, and personally, I think it outshines some of the formal gardens. Here are a few more pictures from the meadow I took on a couple different visits. They also practice prescribed burns, which are part of the natural cycles of renewal in our region. Our plants are adapted not only to die back in winter, but also have deep roots to survive fire. Invasive plants are much less resistant, and so big meadows like this can cut down on invasive species with fire. Additionally, native bees have a positive relationship with fire, with larger populations in meadows that are burned about every 3 years or so. Okay, so that's Ladue. Another museum that has taken a big step forward in native plants is Stoneleigh. In the late 1800s, this estate was built in Villanova, Pennsylvania by Edmund Smith, who was a railroad baron. The extensive gardens were landscaped in traditional formal ways until 1996, when Natural Lands, a land conservation organization, took over the property. Natural Lands typically holds large protected wild spaces, so this was a new situation for them. Looking at the typical maintenance required to keep up such an estate, they began to consider native plants as a lower maintenance alternative that would align with their organization's values. The estate is home to numerous species of tree, and around each, there are a variety of native and non-native invasive plantings. So here you can see some of the work they're doing. They're in the process of removing invasive plants and replacing them with similar looking native species. On the left, you can see an enormous amount of native Virginia strawberry moving in amidst the Chinese golden larch. On the right, you can see they have a lot of work to do to remove all of the Pachysandra around this tree. That's the non-native Pachysandra. They favor mass plantings of plants, such as white wood aster, which is one of those rejuvenated beds, and fall sunflower, which you can see on the right on a margin. And they have done some new plantings, such as this enormous walkway garden. Pretty much everything you see in these pictures, including the vines and shrubs, are native plants, and it's pretty breathtaking in summer. One caveat, in this part of the garden, they rely heavily on cultivars, so there may be reduced wildlife value. They are also growing a large meadow area. The portion most distant in the photograph was taller than my head. Lastly, and I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this one directly, is Glenstone in Potomac, Maryland, which is arguably one of the greatest art museums in the world and one of the greatest organic landscaped museums in the world. In this photo, you can see their pavilions gallery in late winter glory. The building is integrated in and under the landscape, which has been grown to approximate a vast native meadow. The interior of their pavilions area is a water feature filled with native aquatic plants. In addition to indoor galleries, they are also known for large outdoor sculptures, such as Split Rocker by Jeff Koons on the right here, which is covered with annual flowers each season and then fed hydroponically from the inside. These are now the only non-native plants that they plant. This is a massive sculpture, equal weight, unequal measure, by Richard Serra, far from the main museum, which is only accessible by way of a woodland trail. And if you kind of look at that doorway in the distance, here's a view out of that onto the woodland trail, which they are actively managing and have been restoring with native plants. Their gardens are marked by the use of contrasting natural and artificial materials in and around the pathways, which gives a very distinctive feel to the whole place. I particularly like their use of pachara and phlox together around this sycamore. And their use of pachara along with pre-existing daffodils and native sedges is stunning. All of these are great inspirations we can bring home to our local museums, including our own Laurel Museum. Okay, so how do we get started? Our project evolved from what I believe was a casual conversation between Anne and Brian Coyle, who founded Laurel Patuxent. The garden beds had a few plants, mostly bare mulch, and they had talked about native plants as an option. Brian reached out to me, and together we met with Anne and her staff to walk around the whole property and see what was already there. Once we finished the walkthrough, we talked about the museum's vision for the garden. The pre-existing garden beds were fairly bare, especially in the winter. However, there were some structural plants along the front of the museum we could work with. There were about 5 winterberry shrubs and a redbud. And here's a close-up of the foliage with a winterberry on the left and a redbud on the right. We had some things to work with. The other side of assessing a site is looking at invasive plants either on or near the property. Invasive plants are those that are both non-native to the area and actively spread through wild places and cause damage to our environment. Invasives can either require a preliminary removal effort or can threaten your garden after planting. At the Laurel Museum, there is a large invasive tree, a Callery or Bradford pear. Get my pointer out here again. Bradford pear right in the middle of our shade garden. Additionally, the area has a large amounts of English ivy, lesser celandine, and garlic mustard nearby. For the tree, there wasn't much we could do at the moment. Should the museum decide to take it down in the future, we'd make a plan to safeguard any plantings during that work. For the other invasive plants, we were lucky they weren't broadly found in the garden beds. So a careful weeding each season would be the only mitigation needed. If we chose to create additional gardens on other parts of the property, we would need to do some removal first. Right. My favorite part of the process is the visioning process. Gardening isn't the same as commercial landscaping. It's not just about what will work, but it's also about the why. Speaking with Anne and her staff, they wanted something low maintenance because their on-site staff would likely have little time or energy to take care of the garden on their own. It needed to be attractive and engaging to visitors. Also, the plants couldn't block the sign out front. They were also interested in joining the growing native plant movement, learning more as a staff about native plants, and perhaps helping educate the community about native gardening in their own homes. That said, there weren't a lot of constraints placed on us. I'm pretty sure Anne said go wild at some point, which is always fun at the beginning of a project. I just mentioned maintenance, and I want to take us down a side road for a minute on the topic of land stewardship. A land steward is someone who takes responsibility for the soil, water, plants, and animals that exist on a piece of land. While you're in the visionary stage of a new public garden project, it's important to understand and identify who the land steward is. The first part of this is avoiding bad assumptions about who it is. It's not necessarily the designer, as it may only be involved in the beginning of a project, as that person may only be involved in the beginning of a project. It's not necessarily the implementation team, as their skills, focus, and energy may revolve only around the initial implementation. It's a poor assumption to look at the organization that runs the property and assume, oh, it'll be the president of the board. As a rule, executives and senior staff always have too much on their plate to take on the job directly. And then the laziest approach to land stewardship is to say, oh, the community will manage it. Even the most community-centric spaces, like community garden plots, where there's still a central person or team responsible for making sure the greater mission and vision of the space is on track, especially when it's cold and rainy and nobody is thinking about their personal garden plot. So what are our requirements for a land steward? It needs to be someone who will be there after the installation is done. There needs to be a clear line of authority from the property owner to themselves. Going back to the board president, they probably aren't going to go out and pick up branches after a storm, but they can have a person or group that they would delegate that accountability to. Usually that person or group is who I would call the land steward. Ultimately, when nobody else is thinking about the space, that's when the land steward is both reactively managing the land and proactively planning for the future. Without a land steward in place, it's best to pause the project until you know who it is. It may not seem like it, but it's a huge red flag for a project if you don't have a land steward agreed upon yet. Land stewards have authority, either direct or delegated, to approve most decisions, choose stewardship policies, and make durable plans for the future. Without clear stewardship, a motivated team can put together a great plan and even break ground. But that work is always at risk of an under-involved stakeholder canceling the project. And it does happen more often than you might think. Plus, even a perfectly executed garden can wither away over the next few years for lack of maintenance or because the stewardship practices conflict with the project. So if we apply the model I've been describing, Anne is the executive who is accountable for land stewardship, and she has delegated that down to Laurel for the Patuxent. I'm the point person at the Laurel Museum garden for the Laurel Museum garden within L4P. From there, it's on me to proactively manage the space, sometimes calling on volunteers for help. If we need a budget for something, or we need to coordinate with the city who owns the property, that's where I go back up to my executive sponsor, Anne, and she can help us navigate that. I will admit, we did not take an extremely disciplined approach to clarifying the land stewardship in this project. However, we got lucky. Anne and her team have been extremely easy to work with, and I've had the time to pop down the street regularly and make sure things are looking okay. For subsequent projects, though, I've always made sure that we have the land stewardship steward identified early in the process. All right, let's talk about the design, which I know some of you are probably eager to get into the weeds, so to speak. We decided not to create any new areas and instead make sure that all the mulch beds were densely planted with natives. I looked primarily at the amount of light each bed would get, as this area near the river remains fairly moist much of the time. I divided the area up into 4 beds. There's a full sun bed around the Laurel Museum sign, which has that height requirement. The right side of the front bed is in full sun. The left side of the front bed is in part shade with the winterberry, when the winterberry leaves out. And a truly shady bed is off a ways from the museum building. I did the designs primarily with lists of species and estimated quantities for each. However, to make it easier for the museum staff, I've gone back and made these extremely simple Google Sheets diagrams. I now start new projects with these diagrams, and it makes planting very easy. A landscape architect can make a much more attractive diagram in AutoCAD, but for planting out parcels of discrete ground, I don't think it's necessary. The exact layout of each plant becomes unimportant over time as they spread. One of the fundamental aspects of all native garden design is planting in layers. This is a diagram from Planting in a Post-Wild World by Thomas Rayner and Claudia West. First, you want to identify your structural layer, which for this garden I would consider to be the winterberry, the shade trees, and even the Laurel Museum sign. Next, it's really important to skip the middle layer and go right to ground cover. Each bed needs an appropriate ground cover layer, either as a mass planting or as a dense matrix, in order to claim the ground from any emergent weeds. Ground cover eats up most of your budget unless you're planting large things. And so it's important that you get it right. Otherwise, you're going to have bare ground. Finally, we get to the layer that most gardens I see out in the world start and end with, which is the seasonal interest layer. These plants often exist for only a couple months above ground and may bloom for even less than that. So if you plant these seasonal interest plants, if you only plant these seasonal interest plants, you're going to find yourself with a bare garden most of the year. One question I'm often asked is whether or not the seasonal interest plants can cohabitate with the ground cover. The answer is yes, because generally ground covers come up in like March and April and then go dormant when a taller plant covers them up. These taller plants will actually grow up taller and straighter and be less likely to flop over, which I'm sure some of you have experienced, because they have pressure underground on their roots from those ground cover plants. So it's a relationship that already exists. As we talk through the designs, I'm not going to include every species in the interest of time, so consider these representative of the kinds of things we planted. Sign beds are a unique challenge because they have to serve their function first, sign visibility. For this sign, we needed plants no taller than 2 feet. I chose golden Alexanders as the primary ground cover, as it will grow in size each year, has those yellow blooms you see on the left-hand side throughout most of the year, and is great for stopping weeds. It's also the host for the black swallowtail butterfly. There are 2 colors of moss phlox growing in the front. Here's one of them, and which bloom early and will stand up well to the hot, dry environment in the edges of that bed. There was also some scarlet bee balm in place, so we left that where it was. And we added some butterfly weed, which has an orange bloom and hosts the monarch butterfly, and of course is a favorite feeding point again for the fritillaries. And over time, I've gone back and added more golden Alexanders to continue to cover the ground. The full sun bed next to the exit is where I could let loose a little bit. It was dry and sunny again, but with no height restriction. I put golden ragwort along the right half as the primary ground cover among the tall meadow-like plants, and it will spread aggressively. For some variety, I switched to plantain leaf pussy toes for the left half. I have pictures of these on the next slide. And they also spread tightly hugging the ground and putting up an interesting flower in late spring. Our initial seasonal interest planting included spotted bee balm, which I have here, orange coneflower, which most people think of as perennial black-eyed Susans. You can see them at the bottom of the image. Wrinkle leaf goldenrod, which has a lot of wildlife value. I also added beard tongue to the bed because it will have a nice May bloom and also eventually become another ground cover. The nice thing about this bed is that the seasonal interest plants are easy to add now that we have our ground covers in place. So here are those two ground covers up close. This is like about a month ago, so they're a little bit early in their season. On the left, if you look closely, you'll see a million little baby leaves between each of the mother Pachara plants. Those are each now growing into full-size plants, and by the end of the year, they will completely cover any bare ground. Mind you, this will not interfere with the big meadow plants coming up through them. On the right, you can see how large these pussy toes have grown in a year and a half. They started from plugs, which are 2 inches wide, and they're now about 10 times that size. Under the stand of winterberry, I wanted to create a low mat of ground cover and then introduce some pops of color and interest. The ground cover is green and gold, which is very short, evergreen ground cover with little flowers that are just emerging. Once again, you can see how wide they've spread across the ground. They may touch eventually, even if we don't help them along. The pops of color were a little more of a challenge in this bed. We put some ferns in the back, which died away, and it was only later we realized that there is a significant rain shadow from the roof and that the area was too dry for them. We also planted coral bells or heuchera and a native bleeding heart. The former didn't thrive, and the latter has just reappeared, so we will have another chance to see their purple-red hearts. Here's what the green and gold will look like in about a couple weeks' time from now. A nice poofy plant, and there will be a lot of it this year. Here's a wider angle of the whole garden from last week. Plus, there is some bleeding heart I just found that's coming up, and a picture of columbine from my own garden, which I think we're going to see this year in red and yellow lanterns hanging over just under the winterberry. Of all the beds, this is the one that may have been the toughest, both for a reason I'll get to later, and because I had not personally worked much in the shade before this. Shade beds are a lot less, have a lot less sun energy coming in. And even when the trees above them are bare, so that the plants, even when the trees above them are bare, the plants will break dormancy slower and not grow as explosively as their sunny counterparts. The area also had few organic boundaries beyond the trees that were there and the edges of the mulch. My two ideas were to try different types of ground cover for variety and also to build a little structure with a path through the middle. For the edges, you'll see there is Pachara again, which is doing very well. And in the middle, I tried an assortment of coral bells, foam flower, columbine, wild ginger, bleeding heart, lady fern, and whitewood aster. And they're all kind of represented in this image here. Here's a close-up of the native bleeding heart, which has a long bloom time. We put a whitewood aster in an old hollow stump. I checked it today. It's doing very well. And the Pachara is starting to bloom. And this is in shade, so it's a little behind the sun beds. This is what my front yard looks like right now, and it will soon look like that as well. It looks nice in a mass planting. The other experiment I tried was adding in ephemerals and other very early season plants. Ephemerals live only in deciduous woods. They start coming up in March and take in all the sun that they can coming from between the bare branches. They tend to have an interesting flower and specialist bees associated with them. Then when the leaves come in the canopy above, they disappear until next year. We planted bluebells, ramps, Jack in the pulpit. There's Mayapples in the background of that image, as well as a little wild ginger, actually, and trout lily. We've had mixed success with the bluebells and ramps coming up reliably, the others a little more slowly. Trout lily takes about 7 years to bloom, so sometimes they're investments. Okay, so that's the design. Once we had that rough design in place, I worked up a cost estimate and set a budget of $450 for plants. At the time, it was a little harder to reliably find all of the plants in the retail space, so I took some guesses on prices. We would try to find plugs if we could, those smaller sizes, as well as straight species rather than cultivars. I ended up driving all over the place, filling up my car with plants, as you can see here. One way I was able to save the project a lot of money was by getting plants from friendly native gardeners who are willing to share with us. All of the Pacura, wild ginger, and Mayapples were donations. As October 2022 approached, the Laurel Historical Society advertised the event through all their channels, as did Laurel for the Patuxent. This informed the community about what we were doing and recruited a few volunteers who helped us plant and pull initial weeds. The museum staff subsequently watered during the following weeks in the mornings. Beyond that, they haven't had to do any watering except for new plants we've added occasionally. One thing I noticed as soon as the warmer months came on was that the plants were growing more slowly than I expected, and a few even died out. I had planted into what I thought were more harsh conditions in the past and seen how quickly our natives bushed up from plugs and quartz. At the time, I thought it was either the impact of the shade or the density of the mulch that had been laid down over the years. That adds more carbon to the soil than is needed for many of our native plants. However, it turns out that when the city was maintaining the beds, the mulch they were using was from reclaimed wood. That mulch has chemicals in it that are toxic to many plants. We've taken over maintenance of the beds and removed the newest layer of mulch, so the plants should now begin remediating the soil. Also, the city is going through a comprehensive review of their practices and has now discontinued the use of the toxic mulch across many city gardens. So expect things to look a little greener around the city as well. I bring all of this up because when you work with land that's new to you, and especially when that land has had no proactive stewardship in the past, you can run into things like this. Ask a lot of questions about what was done in the past, who did it, and whether it's expected to continue. For a garden with dense ground cover, mulch is more harm than help. So Anne helped us clarify with the city staff that they can take this garden off of their annual list. All right, the following spring after installation, our new plants were very small, and so they weren't yet able to repel the winter weeds. We advertised a weeding event to recruit a larger crowd, and it was a great success. A lot of community members came out to see what was going to come up that year in the garden. I held a little orientation, you can see here, to our plants versus the weeds, going through and pulling each of the weeds and helping folks identify one leaf from another. This also gave us a chance to talk about what we had planted and why. I ended up continuing to mentor folks throughout the weeding as people needed a lot of support. However, I'm very confident that none of our plantings got pulled up, and it's a model I've now followed numerous times here and at other sites. Continuing the trend of after installation, ornamental gardens tend to get a lot of maintenance focus during the warmer months, but are considered off in the winter. Stewarding of a garden for wildlife goes on every day of the year. The property has tons of deciduous trees, including a huge willow oak. So instead of buying wood bark mulch last year, we simply raked the leaves from the grass and piled them into the beds. Note that we did not chop the leaves up first, which will generally kill anything that has already taken up residence and is resting in those leaves for the winter. This definitely cut down the number of weeds I saw this year, and it provided shelter for lots of insects that we'll be excited to see pollinating our plants in the summer. Speaking of year-round maintenance, there is more to come for this garden. On April 28th, on Children's Day, the museum will have its first event to include interpretation of the garden for visitors. I'm going to hand it off to Abby for a minute here to talk about that.
Hi, thank you, Jimmy. So yes, so we Children's Day is a twice a year event that we have, and typically the focus centers around something that's going on in the museum currently. So the one that is happening this spring, later this month, is focused on native plants and plants in general. So it is appropriate for children of all ages. We say it's probably best focused on kids about preschool through fifth grade, but anyone is welcome to come. There'll be snacks, there'll be crafts, there'll be general activities to do with native plants, with planting for food, with things that plants are used for. So we're very excited to have this event and to have a map of the garden for some of our younger visitors to go out and explore. So thank you, Jimmy.
Thanks, Abby. Very exciting. And then for the garden itself, we're thinking May will be our next management event, perhaps for older residents. Our ground, though, frankly, I think it's great bringing kids into the garden because you'd be surprised how effectively they can weed. Our ground covers have all gotten quite mature, and we can split them up and spread them further to cover any remaining bare areas. Also, we're going to try taking some of the pacra and planting a line of it to try to disrupt this lesser celandine that's kind of climbing up the hill toward the museum. That's a bit of an experiment, but other gardeners I've talked to have reported some success. And lastly, we're going to check the trees for climbing vines and cut them if needed. Plus, there's always a little weeding to do at that time of year. Over the summer, I'll be working with the museum to plant the full sun area more densely with those seasonal interest plants, as we now kind of have our ground cover established. And we'll be working on some interpretive materials and signage as well. Lastly, if you want some inspiration, the garden tour is happening all across Laurel on June 22nd, and a number of gardens on the map, including mine, will be showcasing native plants. I know some folks on the webinar tonight are likely to conduct their own projects in partnership with other organizations. So here's a recap of the steps that we took. Note that this is very much not a comprehensive list, as project management has many facets, but these are the steps that are sometimes skipped, so I wanted to call them out. Meet to discuss your vision. Make sure the core folks involved in the project are all on the same page about the intent of the new garden. Make sure you understand who all the stakeholders are. Meet them, ideally in a group setting, not in just infinite little pairwise conversations, and collectively come to an agreement about who land stewardship will fall to. Break up the project into logical areas. And if you think you're biting off too much, possibly phases as well. Design those areas, thinking first about your ground cover. Develop a budget and plan how you will acquire the plants and any other materials you'll need. Proactively plan your watering, maintenance, and other stewardship activities, like using leaves as mulch, hand weeding, etc., before installation. As soon as the plants are in the ground, the project can often lose some momentum, and folks won't be as excited for yet another planning activity. So get it done ahead of time so your plan's already in place and you can just kind of coast through the steps. And lastly, the fun part, install the garden either with your core team or with members of your community. Here's some very simple resources for getting started. A great place to start for plant selection is the Fish and Wildlife Service's Native Plants for Wildlife Habitat and Conservation Landscaping. And this is the Chesapeake Bay Watershed book. I've included a link in the slides to an interactive version as well as a link to the PDF. And the slides will be made available after in a few days to participants over email. To find native plants for sale and generally to learn more about native plants, the Maryland Native Plant Society is an excellent resource. Right now, they have a just updated page with all of the native plant sales going on in the next couple months, as well as a list of permanent nurseries and growers of native plants. If you'd like to learn more about Laurel for the Patuxent and perhaps join us in our activities, I recommend visiting our site and checking through the projects section. Follow us on Facebook and sign up for our email list, and that will generally keep you informed. Lastly, if you're in Laurel, I'm your neighbor, and I generally want to see more residential gardens growing native plants. If you like, I'd be happy to come out and give you a consult on how to get started. Or if you have questions from this talk, you can reach out with those as well. If we don't get to them tonight. You can use this email address, nativegardenguy@gmail.com. Shocked it wasn't taken. Thanks to everybody who listened to the story of our garden. I hope you get a chance to stop by this season or any other time. And obviously, please visit the museum when you're there. And I think we're ready for Q&A. Or maybe announcements, I think Anne wanted to do first.
Yeah, no, that's great, Jimmy. Thank you so much. Yes, we have lots of curious questions coming in. So what I'll do now is I'll let Abby kind of go through the chats, let Jimmy catch his breath, and then I'll share my screen for a couple of upcoming announcements. So just want to thank Jimmy right off the bat for such an informative and inspiring presentation tonight. And especially what you were saying earlier about the idea of place. And so often in our interpretation at museums, we focus so much on the power of place. And it's important for me to do that at the Laurel Historical Society because we are fortunate that we have a very passionate local residents, and they come to the museum year after year. But we also want to connect to visitors who might be stopping in from outside of Laurel, or who are coming in from that side of the country. Or who just moved to the neighborhood. So it's really that idea of place, connecting us now here at this museum to the folks who have lived here for generations, to the indigenous populations that came before us, but also the power of place that connects us and grounds us literally to the natural environment. So I'm really happy that you included that powerful concept in your talk tonight. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna actually share my screen, Jimmy. So I'm gonna kick you off for just a second, but we can put up those links in just another minute. Okay, so again, just real quick going through our announcements. I just wanted to reiterate again, Jimmy's welcome to come to Laurel and to the Laurel Historical Society if you have not already been to town. We currently have our exhibit up called It's All Laurel, City Limits and Beyond, which explores all the areas where Laurel is home in all 4 counties. And we have free admission. We're open Friday, Saturday, and Sunday from 12 to 4. So we hope to see you out sometime in the spring and beyond. We also have a temporary exhibit. It opened in February and it'll go through June. And that's the African American voting experience in Laurel, featuring the historic elections of last year. We looked about 100 years in the past and looked at some of our items in our collection to tell the story of civil rights and the voting experience for about the last 100 years. And so that is also on display at the Laurel Museum at the time. Like Jimmy mentioned, we do have a few events coming up, and you are welcome to get dirty with us, whether you are digging and planting native plants in your garden, or whether you wanted to celebrate Archaeology Month with us. So April is Archaeology Month in Maryland, and we have 2 drop-in days coming up tomorrow and the 19th during our open hours. It's just a free kind of drop-in just to see some of the activities that we have, some of the artifacts that we found on site, and then weather permitting, we will have a dig day at the end of the month. So please contact us for registration and for more information on that. I just wanted to leave this here. The talk that we had last month in our spring speaker series focused on current women business owners, nonprofit leaders, and I just wanted to also point out that the high tea is happening still for Peace on the Patuxent on May 4th. Also in May, we have our annual meeting. So that is for the Laurel Historical Society. Everybody is welcome to come. You do not have to be a member of the organization, but we hope you hope you are. We also serve light refreshments, and we'll have an after-hours tour of the museum, showcasing those 2 exhibits I just talked about. Later in the summer, we will be having a story time and craft activity at the museum. So you're welcome to register for that coming up and just hold those dates for story time at the museum. And just finally, rounding out some of our programs with some of our special events. June 2nd is our annual gala, featuring a speakeasy Roaring 20s Jazz Age theme. It will take place on June 2nd at Savage Mill, and tickets are on sale now. If you go to our website, you'll be able to purchase those. And also the Laurel Garden Tour, like Jimmy mentioned, we are really excited. We brought this back 2 years ago, and we bring it back every other year. And tickets are also available for this, and we're excited that there are going to be several gardens that focus exclusively on native plants. So we're very happy to partner with those garden owners and to bring these beautiful gardens to Laurel and beyond. Just very quickly, I mentioned membership as a park, not only for the annual meeting, but also for the garden tour. So if you are a member or need to renew your membership, please join or renew today. And if you are not a member and not in the area but still want to support us, please consider sending a small donation to help us out for our virtual programming. And that is us. So please look out in the next couple of days for an email. It'll come from info@laurelhistoricalsociety.org. You're welcome to reply to that email to get more information about any of our programs or upcoming events, anything we do at the museum or here in Laurel. And it'll also be loaded with all the links that Jimmy shared tonight, as well as a link to the recording on our YouTube channel. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I'm going to pass it over to Abby to get us started on some of the questions.
Okay. So it seems like, Jimmy, you caused quite a commotion with bringing up reclaimed mulch. And people are wanting you to elaborate more on what exactly reclaimed mulch is. And outside of its previous use in city beds, is there any chance that people are using this in their own personal gardens? Just elaborating on mulch and its uses and how it should be used.
Absolutely. It's weird that a question I answer a lot about is about mulch. It's such a broad topic that comes up over and over in gardening. So the specifics I don't know a lot about. I know that the idea is that it's mulch that from wood that was something else previous that was chipped up. So I don't know what was in there. Could have been varnished or sealed or something like that, or perhaps some other process applied to it. And I think the main reason people use it is cost. But I don't know too much more about it other than it's sort of a generalized issue with these types of mulches. I think they're not widely in circulation in home garden sources, like where you would go to your garden center and pick up some mulch. Usually they'll say on the bag what it's from, and most of those are like wood bark mulch, where it's the outer hydrophobic side of the wood that it repels water, and you put that down in your garden. And I will say that when I do use mulch, which we didn't need to use it for this project, I'm primarily using that as a smothering tool, and sometimes as a way to kind of reclaim the ground in certain ways. But that's always for me a interior, or primarily the interior of the tree, and that's wood chip mulch, and you get that for free from arborists around the area. When they take down a tree and chew it up, they will happily give it to you, because otherwise they have to pay somebody to tip it into the waste management system. So chipdrop.com or getchipdrop.com, I think both of those work, is a tool for hooking up arborists with residents. I've gotten 2 of them. Fair warning, the minimum amount you're getting still for free is like 20 cubic yards. So it's a lot. But if you're smothering your lawn, it's great. And generally, I would just say we don't need to use mulch in native gardens. You need to plant more densely, and then you have green mulch or living mulch, and that's the big the big shift that I'm seeing more and more people do, and you're just getting more plants and more flowers, and it's great. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much for elaborating on that. We did have a question specific to the museum garden, and they wanted to know, were sedges outside the budget for the ground cover layer, or did they not meet the selection criteria that you were using?
Sedges would be a great choice. We kind of were going on a first early stages and getting in some plants, but we are thinking about adding additional things. And in that shady area, a moist area, I think sedges would be a great addition. Definitely. I'll just say from my experience, in the 2 full sun beds, even the most sun tolerant sedges would probably be too hot and dry for them. But yeah, in that shady area, I think a sedge would be a great thing. And additionally, you could add more. We've added some ferns that tend to spread over time, so that's another texture that you could choose.
Okay, this one I think is just a broadly related to all the projects that you've worked on. Have you ever worked on projects with very wet areas with high salinity soil?
Not specifically in high salinity soil, but I can maybe give a recommendation, because there is a plant that even like kind of municipalities will sometimes use. So when you think about high salinity soil, you always have to go back wherever you're planting. What am I replicating from nature? What's the thing that is an area that already is like this? I mean, if there's a true problem with the soil, which is rare in my experience, then you might need to amend it or something. But generally, you want to work with what you've got. What's a place that has relatively high salinity? The coastal plain, the beach area, the ocean, salt spray. And there are grasses and sedges and rushes and many other of those kinds of plants that are just intrinsically salt tolerant, because they do get inundated with salt water periodically. But for home gardeners, especially if it's not constantly inundated, but it's just very wet, you can't do much better than native hibiscus, Hibiscus moschutos. It is salt tolerant, and that's one reason it's sometimes planted on roadsides, because we create a salt problem as well, where you have a road that has salt on it, and that runs off the sides, and that can make the sides very challenging. So if that's the concern for a homeowner, Hibiscus moschutos is a beautiful plant, and there are many others. If you go into the website, the nativeplantcenter.net, which is actually Alliance for the Chesapeake, that you can do a search just for, I think there's a salt tolerant option, and they certainly make notes in there when it is.
Okay, thank you so much. We get some really wonderful feedback too. So thank you to everyone who passed along all the great comments. Jimmy, there's lots of them in there for you to go review later. I also wanted to call out uh, Dennis, who's all the way from Southern California, had left a very specific comment about California's definition of native plants, which seems to be kind of different than Maryland's definition of native plants. I think we may need to follow up on that one. So Dennis, if you want to leave your email, we can maybe put you in contact with Jimmy for that.
Awesome. And yeah, I mean, that's something that's really important for people to be aware of. You'll go to a garden center here, or you might go to a garden center in Illinois, and these big box stores, they'll say this, and they're native to America, like somewhere. It might even be not even North America. It could be Central America. And what you really want to look at is, what are the plants native to my ecoregion? We're in vaguely those two areas. And even within that, you can kind of go to your parks and your wild spaces and see what's there. And those plants already do well here. So try to replicate what you're seeing, and try to bring those concepts into your home. And then you'll kind of have all these plants with a natural affinity for, the immediate area already.
That's great. And just another quick shout out. One of our participants said that and she's also a BS MS in microbiology, and she's retired and living in Indiana. So there's another one in the crowd tonight.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah. And maybe that's another thing I can just kind of riff off of, which is saying that like, I'm not a botanist. I'm not a horticulturist. I, didn't go to school for ecology. But I did learn how to read a paper. And so I can, dig down into a reference to something. But I'll just say that there are so many resources now that are available for people if they want to learn something and understand the why underneath something that was said. There's usually a paper trail, so to speak, that you can chase down and learn for yourself. And you can usually reach out to scientists. They're desperate to talk about all the work they do. And I mean, it's just so great to be able to talk to folks like that. So I would recommend, don't be shy, reach out. You might get a reply with somebody who's like, oh, I have so much to say about your question. And of course, one thing I'll say is if you have a question I can't answer, I'm always happy to try to find somebody who can.
Mhm. Yeah, and thank you again for saying that, Jimmy, because just even in the interactions with you and then, kind of diving a little bit into the wider community, I have found that, everyone is very generous with their time, especially you and tackling this project, but, also with giving plantings or cuttings or plugs or anything like that. So people are very generous. So if you are concerned about how to get started or the expense of getting started, it's a very generous community. So I think it would be a lot easier to get started than you might think.
That's such a good point. I'll say half the plants in my garden were free because they were from a person I met, and some of those people are now my friends. So it really is a good way to develop community. It's very local. And I'll say one more thing about that. If you go to that Maryland Native Plant Society website and look up the sales, I may have, I guess, sort of buried part of that in that it's not all sales. There are plant shares as well. And most of the time it's a share, not a swap. You don't have to bring something to get something. In fact, usually it's somebody like me who's like got 10,000 of something and they need to have 1,000 of something. And so they brought the other 9 to the share and saying, hey, take it all. I don't want to leave with it. And so you might be surprised how much you walk away from some of these plant shares. They're all happening basically in the next 4 weeks. So do look for those. People will be very happy to make you the owner of new plants.
Okay, well, that's excellent. So I think this is a good point to stop the recording. We'll stay on for a couple more minutes if anybody has any last minute questions or contacts. But again, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Jimmy, this is fascinating, and just your passion and enthusiasm is just very contagious, as we can see from all the great feedback in the chat. So thank you for being with us tonight. Thank you for everyone who's watching live or the recording, and we hope to see you at the museum, and we hope to see you in your own gardens as well. So thank you, and have a great rest of your night.
Thanks, Ann. Thanks everybody for coming out. This was a great time for me too. I'm glad to share the story.